Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is SockBot, and today I want to talk about what is playing right in front of you. So, if you haven't seen my previous videos, I have been doing a lot of just practice with create mode. I built a few sculptures, and the one that I've shown on this channel so far was a town from Spongebob. But I want to talk more about the second thing that I was working on, and well, I guess this is probably the sixth or seventh thing that I've been working on since early access was released. But the second thing that I want to talk about today, and that is the bubble bowl. Now, if you've seen the episode of SpongeBob and Geeks, it's like everyone's favorite episode. There is a moment in that episode where the whole crew, SpongeBob, Patrick, Mrs. Puff, Pearl, Sandy Cheeks, Squidward, everyone is performing, well, Squidward's conducting, and Plankton's there too. Everyone is performing in this wonderful display that was recently mimicked in the a halftime show for the Super Bowl here in the United States, and it was hilarious, not as exciting as I wanted it to be, but I wanted to recreate that scene because I'm working a lot on kind of classic cartoon-esque visuals from like the early 2000s, and this was a great example of it. So, in addition to that, improving my techniques was part of the reason for this, but I wanted to work on weird shapes. And most specifically, I wanted to work on glass because I had not delved in to make any glass yet. I knew it was possible. I knew that there were workarounds to do it since you can't change the opacity of shapes, but this was my first time actually going in and doing it. And so I'm going to basically talk through this level and talk about different things that I learned while making this level in a sort of more informal tips video than here are the 5 things that you're doing wrong and you should change, because this is not me saying anything that you are doing wrong. This is me saying stuff that I learned while making this, and perhaps you can benefit from it, or if not, you can just sit there and listen. That's totally fine too, whatever makes you happy. So, if you like this video, please leave a like down below. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more, but no pressure as always. So I'm going to get right into it with the turf on the, under the bowl. So making a football field seems pretty easy. I mean, you just create this giant long field with white stripes in it, not super complicated, but I did want to make it somewhat scaled, and so I've been using the general puppet to scale things, because if you don't have a scale off of anything, I mean, down the road you could run into some huge issues with the technology being too small, but you don't really have to do this. It's just something that I felt would make things easier for me so that I could use that as my art scale. So using that, I created this field, and for most techniques like this that are repeating terrain, like the road I created in one of my previous videos, like I said, for the town SpongeBob theme, I've been using this technique where I make that block, like the long block for the turf. I make one big long green block and edge it with white, and then very slightly on the other side put some white, and then I want to make them long enough so that they can overlap with each other when I clone them. That way there's no gap in between the terrain. But you have to make sure that the colors are the same and that the terrain properties are the same, or else when they overlap like that, they're going to kind of glitch and do this weird visual bug where they go between the two colors or go between the two terrains or finishes. So you have to make sure that they are the same finish, you have to make sure they're the same flex, and you have to make sure that they have the same tweaks and the same colors. And yes, that sounds like a lot, and it actually was for this football field, because it took me quite a while to get it perfectly, especially because I do really struggle with the clone tool. I wish when you cloned, you could then nudge things without completely undoing it. Like, when you clone something and you make 10 clones in a row, like you hold the clone button and you hit square a bunch of times. I believe that's the right control. This is me talking about it after the fact. But when you do that and then you let go and it just moves ever so slightly off, and it's infuriating because you have to redo it, I wish that you could just pull that back. They figured it out with the gyroscope? No, not gyroscope, with the kaleidoscope feature, and that works perfectly. You can change the kaleidoscope parts afterwards, but yeah, it's just a small frustration. So once I was done with that, I did move on to the stadium, and so this was where I had to create the glass, and that was probably the biggest, most unique thing that I created in this level. And so, wasn't my favorite, but we'll talk about my favorite in a second. So for the glass, I actually looked up what some other people had been doing, because I knew the general idea. You want to create something with painting, and you want to make that painting be less opaque, because you can't change opacity of shapes, so you change the opacity of paintings, and then you can actually create a shape that kind of a shell in this case, because it's supposed to be the top bowl of the glass dome there. You can create that shape, make it thin enough to, resemble glass, and make that one invisible so that characters can't pass through it, but they're not going to see that. They're going to see the painting. And so for the painting, you obviously want to paint over this whatever it is and make sure that it matches it in terms of boundaries, and it actually is in the same space as the physical shape is. But with the painting, the issue I was running into was, well, depth perception, basically. So instead what I did, and I talked about this in a previous video, I used what I like to call the shape guide technique. And that's basically using that shape, in this case a shape that I ended up keeping, but you don't always have to keep it. Sometimes you can just use it and place it down so that it serves as a guide, and using that to kind of stamp against. So basically with this dome created that was eventually going to be invisible, I then went into, well, I left it visible so I could do this, but I then went into a new painting separate from the shape and the sculpture. And I took a little square, and I took this, this was probably the only thing I took from someone else. I borrowed their suggestion for what painting tool to use. It honestly doesn't matter, but this one just was the most simple. It's just the plain square. And so what I did was I created a grid pattern that covered the entire sphere bit by bit. I couldn't swipe to paint across it super easily, unfortunately, because when you're using what I was using, which is the surface snap, you paint, and the second that you start moving from that, it kind of ignores the surface snap and starts painting wherever you point it. So instead, I just did square by square over the whole thing. I did half of it, and then I copied it to the other half and merged the painting. So that's what I did for this. And then I got out of that, kind of loosened up the visuals of that painting, and then made it less opaque. And then, of course, made the inside sphere invisible. So now we have something that looks relatively like glass. It's still pretty like watercolory, but it's basically good enough. I know that the technique is possible, and if I wanted to make it perfect, I could. But for this, like I said, this is more of a practice type thing for me, slash, appreciation and a study. I guess you would call it like an artistic study, but I'm not very artistic, of early 90s or early 2000s cartoons. So moving on from that, and this was not a very difficult thing to create, but just a fun thing to create, I decided to make that giant, I guess, disco ball. Don't really know what to call it, but it has a bunch of light shooting out of it inside the bubble wool. And so I created that sphere that was just the base of it, and I was like, okay, well, I can use a cylinder with a hole cut out of it. So if you didn't know, if you're like about to place down a shape in a sculpture, you can hold L1 and press square, or triangle and square on the move controllers, and triangle on the left one, square on the right one, or L1 and square on the DualShock, just clarifying there. You can do that, and then you can basically create a hole in the center of a shape. It does different things for various shapes, but if you want to learn anything about that, I made an entire video about shapes, so feel free to go check that out. But for this one, I basically created a hollow cylinder, so it was just kind of this shell, sort of like a sewer pipe, I guess. Just a pipe probably would have, been the simpler way to describe that. But anyways, I created this pipe, and I placed it, almost entirely inside of the sphere, and I was like, okay, so I could create this and place them a bunch of random places, but that's kind of awkward. So instead, what I decided to do was use the kaleidoscope tool. So I had to replace the sphere because I'd moved it around inside the sculpture, but for reference, if you do that, but like make sure if you're going to use the kaleidoscope or the mirror that you don't move the shape inside the sculpture, that you want to be the center of that sculpture. So in this case, I had to basically delete that sculpture, create a new one, and then I used the kaleidoscope feature with these hollow cylinders and with the surface snap on, and I also shrunk the hollow cylinders to be, just about like, I want to say like an inch thick, but I don't really know how to explain that, or an inch tall. And so use the kaleidoscope feature to place those all over the ball in like relatively random locations, and by random I mean like equally spaced, so perhaps not random, but that's what I did. And then I was like, okay, this looks great. I got out, but unfortunately there was no lights in them. So what I decided to do was I took the sculpture, I copied it and placed it immediately on top of it. And when I entered the edit for that clone, obviously it was just a normal clone, so I could edit it freely and leave the other one alone. I deleted everything. Well, actually, before I deleted everything, I placed little filled cylinders inside each of those hollow cylinders, and then deleted everything around the filled cylinders. And then I basically exited that creation and took those those filled cylinders that were now inside the original one, since I deleted most of the clone, and I lit them up. I edited them, went to their glow section and turned that glow up, and then what I realized was the hollow cylinders, I needed to extend them. So basically I just stretched all of those into that center sphere. so that no light was peeking out from the bottom of those hollow cylinders. And then I went back into the glowy ones. That was just looks like a bunch of glowy cylinders inside of the shape when you have all the other things turned off. But I went into there and I painted a bunch of them the different colors that I saw in the actual what do you call it, the cartoon. There we go, that's what I was trying to say. So it was pretty much all of the things that I was excited about. I decided to do one last thing differently than my previous one, and that is when I took the platform that giant, I guess disco ball, I don't know what to call it, was on, and instead of using the painting tool the spray painting tool within that sculpture, I decided to use a painting on top of it. Now I realize this does separate them, but obviously I grouped them afterwards. The point of this was to avoid the difficulty I had previously with getting perfectly straight lines. So obviously this bottom platform is supposed to be some kind of sheet metal that's like drilled into the ground or drilled into some larger piece of metal. And so I had to make sure that each of them was in somewhat square or rectangular panels, made it a little random intentionally, and also to avoid having to make it perfect. And I used the ruler tool combined with the surface snap feature within a painting to make sure that I was painting directly against that perfect floor piece. And then I took the screws that I'd made previously within the last level and kind of enlarged them and placed them where they made sense within the sculpture. This was probably the easiest thing I did, and considering how long it took me to use the spray painting feature to do this on the previous level, this is the better technique almost entirely. The only issue you'll have is around curved edges, but honestly, like I did with the dome, you're welcome to just place them in individual squares using that surface snap technique, and that should pretty much solve your problem. Now, is it perfect? No, but it looks great. I think it looks exactly like I wanted it to, and then, of course, I did make these stands off to the side with all of the different chairs, and that's what filled up the thermometer really quickly, so I probably have to redo that in some more artistic way rather than literally having hundreds of seats there. And so I'll probably do that next when I kind of go back to refine this level. But that, yeah, I had a bunch of different weird things I made in this, so I figured I'd make a video about it and talk a little bit as opposed to just post a time-lapse because, well, I mean, judging by the view count, you guys don't really like time-lapses, so hopefully this time-lapse with some voice is helpful. And if not, I guess you can watch this on mute with your favorite music behind it. Alright, thank you very much for watching. If this video was helpful, please leave a like down below, or if you just enjoyed it, please do the same, and maybe subscribe if you want to see more, but like I said, no pressure. Have a wonderful day. I will talk to you guys in the next video, and for now, goodbye! Whew. Can you tell that I filmed 2 videos today? My voice is getting a little hoarse. Nay.